First, let me add my thanks to DC Internet Society and George Washington University for organizing this event. I think the topic is of enormous importance, and I think it's important that we explore it for new audiences because, as I'll discuss in just a few minutes, this has been a subject of great interest to a group of well-informed people for many years, including many of you in this room. But the audience that needs to address the subjects we're talking about, particularly in this panel, is much, much wider and growing rapidly. It was probably inevitable that the discussion in the two panels would bleed into each other. The future of what happens in this field is of such great interest and great importance that I think you're going to find that this panel is really a continuation of the conversation that began in the previous panel. And I think that's healthy and good because there are so many points of view and so many important topics that need to be addressed. Let me quickly introduce the panelists, and their biographies are available, all of which are quite impressive, and we have a wealth of experience and knowledge here. Chris Mondini is a VP of Stakeholder Engagement, North America and Global Business Engagement for ICANN. Raquel Gatto, who we all heard from earlier, is a Chapter Development Manager of the Americas for the Internet Society. Beatrice Covassi is the first Counsellor for Digital Economy of the EU Delegation to the United States. Derrick Cogburn is an Associate Professor of International Relations at the School of International Service at American University, and Becky Burr is Deputy General Counsel and Chief Privacy Officer for NeuStar. The topic of our panel is possible scenarios for the future of the IANA functions. What are the implications for Internet governance? And I've asked the panelists to in two ways. First, from a fairly high level, which would be relevant for people who are new to this topic and understand that something important must be going on here, but don't know the plumbing, and for people for whom acronyms like IANA and ICANN and CCTLD and all of this are mumbo jumbo, but do understand that the internet is of tremendous importance and growing importance for military, political, economic, social, educational, cultural, and many other reasons. I thought it might be useful just to spend 1 minute at the beginning to sort of set the stage, because although there are many people with great expertise in this room and following, not everyone was around or involved when this whole debate began, which was more than 15 years ago. For those of you who were, you may remember that in the mid-1990s, when the National Science Foundation announced that it was washing its hands of the administration of the central functions of the internet, except for those who were intimately involved in what was still often at that time called the NSFNet, there was a great yawn of who cares and why is this even important? It was by no means obvious in the mid-1990s that a multi-stakeholder model would evolve, or that it would even play an important role in the future of the internet. It is hard to remember, but at that time, the major debate in network computing was whether the French Minitel Teletel system, or the IBM Sears Roebuck Prodigy, or the CompuServe, or this new startup AOL, or this funny named company that was just established itself called Netscape, would be the dominant players in the network computing realm. So it is important today that we look carefully at the multi-stakeholder model, and we look carefully at the sort of how these core functions of the internet will be managed and how they should be managed, in part because at the time that much of this was done 15 years ago, it was a different world and a different place with vastly different inputs into the process. So with that opening, let me begin, and we're going to just work our way down the table. And I'll begin by asking Chris to begin with 10 minutes. And as Tim explained before, we have a 10-minute target for opening remarks, and we will get into questions after that. And for those of you who are online, please feel free to submit your questions. I think the hashtag is DC ISOC or ISOC. I'm sorry, ISOC-DC. Sorry, yes, right behind me, and we will get to them as well. So thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Roger, and thank you very much to the ISOC chapter and for GW for hosting this. I am Chris Mondini. I'm Vice President for Global Stakeholder Engagement related to engagement with businesses globally, worldwide, and recently appointed to North America Stakeholder Engagement. I've recently transferred to Washington, D.C. from the Los Angeles office of ICANN. I noticed the quotient of experts and attorneys has risen precipitously in the audiences that I'm addressing. And that's great because it does raise the level of the debate, and it is reassuring to see the great mind and thinking that are going into applications of the questions before us. But stepping back, as Roger mentioned, we do have a lot of people following online remotely, and we do have a number of people for whom a lot of this information is new, and people who are asking questions like, what is a stakeholder, and what is the current status of how multi-stakeholderism works? And I was very pleased that Roger told his story, because the continuum of where you began and where we are now is really what has led us to this this moment that Fiona discussed earlier in terms of the NTIA and its announcement. Even more than acronyms, too, there's an issue, because we're global at ICANN, of translation. And many of these terms are very difficult to translate. We throw them around in a way that they're not even very clear to native speakers, but words like stewardship, they don't translate for those of you who are linguists, and I know many of you are. Stakeholder is a very difficult thing to translate. Governance is a very hard word to translate. And accountability, one which was very frequently raised in this last panel, and which will be a topic for the months to come, is also very difficult to translate. So in my engagement role, what I try to do with my colleagues around the world is to raise awareness, raise understanding, and increase knowledge of what some of these terms mean in the ICANN context. And I think sometimes having an opportunity to actually experience it is the best way to learn about it. And I know we'll be talking a little bit more about Net Mundial. And for those of you who are there and those of you who are followed, it was a very interesting awareness raising for people who had not seen multi-stakeholderism at work. So even if it's hard to translate into your native language, at least you can see a little bit of what different diverse groups on an equal footing getting together to produce an outcome can look like. So in also my engagement role and at ICANN, you may have noticed not only have we invested in other people like me around the world to bring more people into the ICANN processes and to be responsive to their needs as stakeholders, we do things like invest in infographics. So I brought an infographic on the IANA functions. There's several copies out in front. It's a very technical topic, but as Roger said, it's a very important topic. I was struck by the number of great ideas and the great inputs and the very detailed discussion on what the future could look like as the stewardship of the US government is passed in this process to a global multi-stakeholder community. As ICANN and a convener of the process, however, I can't get into the discussion or the details of the various scenarios. What I can tell you is that we have a process in place. So policymaking and life at ICANN not only involves a lot of acronyms and a lot of people and a lot of diverse voices trying to arrive at conclusions, it also involves a lot of discussion around process. And so shortly after the NTIA announcement, we've convened a couple of public dialogues to seek input. One of those took place at the recent ICANN meeting last month in Singapore, which was alluded to, and one actually took place on the second day of Net Mundial at the end of the day. And it really was a process to define a process. And if you would like to learn more about it and comment on it, the key date, and the reason this panel is so timely, is May 8th. If you use your favorite search engine and look for public comment, IANA, transition, ICANN, you will find where you can look at a synthesis of the inputs that have come in to date that have talked about how, over the next several months, we can begin a process to gather inputs from diverse stakeholders, from diverse geographies, and from people that are very, very much into the details and the technical debates, but also the stakeholders who are only just realizing now that they are stakeholders, that the work of ICANN affects them, whether they're a business and it's their business success, whether they're an NGO that uses the internet to organize, or whether it's a government that sees just how much GDP gains come from an open and seamless and scalable internet. So May 8th is the deadline for everyone to make their inputs into reactions to what this process has called for. True to form, again, something that's very common in the ICANN context, the process calls for the formation of a steering committee. So many of the customers of the IANA functions are included in that, the numbers registries, others who have been represented on the panel. And it really discusses a series of public consultation and dialogue over the coming months. Some at meetings where we know that the stakeholders will be turning up to. So those are the ICANN meetings or the stakeholder meetings that are held by the Internet Engineering Task Force or the regional internet registries. But there will be more meetings, and they will be broader meetings, and they will be in diverse geographies and with the less initiated, less in the day-to-day operations of the DNS and identifiers of the internet. So there's a steering committee. It calls for a series of meetings, and again, it will it reminds what Fiona told us are the requirements that NTIA laid out in their announcement. The expectations of the affected parties must be met. The openness of the internet must be maintained. Security, stability, and resiliency of the domain name system is paramount, and it must support and enhance a multi-stakeholder model and have a result that is not a government-led model or an intergovernmental-led model. Now, again, it's human nature to talk about what those scenarios are. And I used to work for many years as a management consulting where we did scenario planning. And we heard quite a bit about the scenarios, and I think we may hear some more from this panel. But we're at the first stage of a process. We would love to hear from you on how to run that process. You heard also alluded to the discussion of ICANN accountability mechanisms, which started again in Singapore with the session and now has been elevated to be more of an ongoing track that will run alongside the public consultation related to IANA. So again, many opportunities to learn, many opportunities to participate and to comment, and you will see the effects of that participation. A few of the principles and mechanisms that are outlined in this process that's out for the public comment until May 8th were alluded to again in the other panel. So the principles are what you would expect, that accountability must be taken into account. They must be multi-stakeholder, global, again, seek all voices, inputs in many ways to get those inputs. And also the concept of stress testing, of making sure that a future scenario or future global multi-stakeholder solution is feasible and will work, and that many of those stresses and scenarios that were raised can be tested before a new system is put into place. These are all outlined in the process in terms of mechanisms and principles. So have a look and see if you would like to add to those, elaborate on those, or put in some of your own additions to those. There's some challenges to what we face ahead. I think that getting input from people who are newer to this realm, that people who, as mentioned, are more recently learning about the stake they have in the expanding, seamless, global internet. I think that getting a variety of inputs in terms of from the geographies around the world to making sure there's balance, relative balance among these categories that we conveniently have been breaking into: government, private sector, civil society, and the technical organizations. I think those are some of the challenges. And again, I think the scoping issue will be one that will be the subject of dialogue as we go through this process. I also just wanted to make a point about scenario planning. And as in so much with the internet, as it has become really ubiquitous and really influential, both in economics and in political spheres, there's a lot of projection and a lot of scenario planning. And you hear fears about the worst case scenarios, about, well, what if every device is connected to a cloud? Or what if there's a party that knows everything, has a lot of data in one place? And what does that mean for power structures and human freedom and so forth? But there are a lot of best case scenarios too. In terms of the flip side of every worst case scenario, I think there is actually a positive outcome. The ability to use the internet and its data to solve human problems, to respond to crises, to predict outcomes, and to enhance life and economics on the planet shouldn't be forgotten. And so when I look at the NTIA announcement, even though global multi-stakeholder community seems hard to define, I think it is an opportunity to really make a breakthrough, to begin a new paradigm of how transnational vital resources, infrastructure, and tools can be cooperatively managed for the benefit of the globe. Both those people, those 2.8 billion of us that are connected to each other now, and the next billions to come. So I'll leave it with that. I'm a little bit of an optimist, but I'm only in my first month living here in Washington, so we'll see how long it lasts.
Thank you, Raquel.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you, GWU and ISOC-DC chapter for the opportunity to share here a little bit of my experience in Brazil with the Brazilian Internet Steering Committee. Prior joining ISOC, I used to work for the CGIBR, which was in the organization of the Net Mundial last week. And by the way, traffic in DC, even in this rainy day, is not so bad as São Paulo, as many face. So the life experience. Anyway, so coming out of Net Mundial, we came with this idea that it is in the center of everything. And I like Roger first approach by saying that it is one step in the way. We had a long history that brought us into these discussions. We have a long journey ahead of us with upcoming events like the IGF, like the ITU Planning Pot, and many others, like the IANA process discussion that Chris tackled here. So it's good to keep in mind this long journey, this long track that we are following. It's not the end all. It's not we are coming out of it with a single decision, with a single document, for example. But multi-stakeholder is the key word at the moment, right? We hear that despite the difficulty to translate into Portuguese, for example, as we use some kind of similar wording as multi-sectorial, pluralist, but it's not the right concept. Anyway, this is the key word. And as many know and who don't, I want to make the background. The Brazil has a multi-stakeholder body put in place since 1995, so just before even ICANN existed. The Brazilian Internet Steering Committee was created by an interministerial decree from the Minister of Communications and the Minister of Science and Technology. Back then, the commercial internet was just hitting us. And so it was decided that it was better to put all the stakeholders in the table to decide the future of the internet development. And this was a visionary decision that we can see today. So the CGI, in fact, was further confirmed in 2003 by a presidential decree that equals, for the lawyers in the ground, I'm a lawyer, by the way, so it's an ordinary law. So it CGIBR as the multi-stakeholder body to give advice and recommendations on the internet development, as well as to coordinate all the internet services in Brazil, right? So, as I said, since the inception, the multi-stakeholder model was fought. It started with 9 members. Now we have the current number of 21 members in the committee. Being 9 from the government, so assigned from the government, 1 appointed as the internet expert, and 11 elected every 3 years for the slots of 4 in civil society, 4 in the private sector, and 3 in the academia, scientific, technological community. So it's a true multi-stakeholder composition, right? CGIBR has in its long history, and that's the take I think we can bring to the table, that multi-stakeholder process needs perseverance, because it's not easy to keep a dialogue when you have opposite agendas or opposite thinking. But if you keep the goal of having the benefit of the internet, and if you seek for a decision, you are stick to the process, right? So this is the important take that we see. One other thing, for example, giving a concrete example, when the CGIBR decided to have principles on the use of internet back in 2009, the process, in fact, it started in 2007. So it took 2 years and several rounds and several discussions to come to agreement of 10 principles for the use of the internet in Brazil. It's a long process that needs to keep the dialogue ongoing. And I think that's useful for all that we see in Net Mundial. Also, we had last week, and I think this is important to bring, the sanction of the Internet Bill of Rights that preserves the Internet user's civil rights. It was signed by our president during the first day of Net Mundial. This law also brought a lot of multi-stakeholder engagement in the process. It started just after the CGIBR issued the principles. It had also 2 years of public consultations, meaning 2 rounds in an online platform with comments, more than 1,000 reaching, I think, 2,000 comments. It also had a round tour on the main cities in Brazil to gather comments and contributions from the ground. And it ended up with a text that was also agreed and put up for the Congress in 2011. But it was not quite ready yet. It needed further consultation. It needed to go through the stakeholder groups, the representatives, and it was done that way. So after several back and forth and dialogues that were led by the deputy responsible for this process in the deputy camera, a final text was agreed, right, with executive participation, the executive power. This text is not perfect in some ways, but it was something agreed that all could live with, and sets the that's difficult, overarching principles, right? So to allow to the governance, let's say, of the internet in Brazil. We need to further see how this is implemented, and I'm sure that it needs to be done also in the multi-stakeholder way, taking up all this living history that we have. So those are some of the experiences that we had in Brazil that certainly explains why Net Mundial came to us. So further from what we already know, that the President Dilma was motivated by the pervasive surveillance revelations, as it was stated in the UN opening General Assembly last year, that it was fueled by the Montevideo statement. I think we had the domestic cooking that was going on to provide this kind of discussion. So this is my point, let's say, on national level, and I think I'm hitting time. So going faster, and we can go with the questions to deep in this. What I heard from the chapters in Latin America as a follow-up from Net Mundial that might be interesting also to bring is that for developing countries, it called the attention from the governments in a high level, in the high level. So usually those people in the government that would not be attending or paying attention to internet governance, they came in and they are at least aware of the process we are discussing. And also it called a lot of press, media interested, that also reach the end users, reach the community that usually is not aware of this usual suspect discussions. So what's next, right? We came out of Net Mundial with this multi-stakeholder statement, here, multi-stakeholder again. And I believe that the next step is to bring these outcomes to the National Multi-Stakeholder Forum, which is the Internet Governance Forum, that could be strengthening the Internet Governance Forum, along with other pieces that we need to work with, like the funding for the Secretariat, and to have more concrete outcomes. And of course, we need to celebrate Net Mundial as a success, right? Because it proved that multi-stakeholder approach can work. Even the complaints, I was trying to catch up, landed yesterday afternoon. So I was trying to catch up with some of the comments coming from academia, civil society. And I believe that all of them reflects the dynamics of this multi-stakeholder model, where everybody has, of course, an agenda and something to say, but they all were heard at somehow, and they all made conceptions in this back and forth, in this trading. I don't know if trading is the word, but anyway, in this negotiating or in this dialogue, I think it's the better wording. So in my final remarks, let's remember that it is not the end. It is something that the community needs to take, and I believe Internet Society also this defense of the multi-stakeholder process to be taken into the IANA discussions, and celebrating the fact that we have the upcoming meetings to be brought in a positive, let's say Net Mundial brought the positive exercise of the multi-stakeholder dialogue. So that's my remarks. Hope I'm in time.
Thank you very much. Beatrice?
Am I on already?
Yes.
Do I have to push? Right. Well, thanks so much for having me here today, and for giving me this occasion to kind of see the span which has passed in this debate over the last 4 years. My name is Beatrice Covassi, and I'm the first counsellor who has been appointed here for the digital economy. I mention this because it is unusual, if you reflect about it, that a diplomatic mission would have a diplomat dealing with the digital economy. And this is related, if you want, is a great lead that Raquel gave me, and also Christopher, to the whole discussion about how much these themes and subjects have gone out of the technical sphere and have become relevant for external relations, have become relevant for society in general, have become have gotten to the agenda of high-level summits, something which even 5 years ago was not so much the case, I would argue. So as I said, thanks to Susan and to ISOC for inviting me here today. I was participating in similar discussions during my tenure here, and I remember a couple, one with Ambassador Verveer, just maybe before Dubai, let's say, one with Ambassador Kramer, right, before Dubai, but right, and one after, actually. And I think this, the themes we discuss, the issues, the language we use, was at that point slightly different than the one we do now, and the context of Net Mundial is completely different. So I think you can really see in which sense. But I would like to say the general point, and I'm taking a very broad policy view now, is that the post-Snowden paradigm, if you want, had as an effect negative and positive effects, I would say. I mean, the negative effect I mention usually when I talk about these themes, which also makes my life more interesting and my job more interesting, but it is in that internet governance, internet policy, cybersecurity and privacy have become much more entangled, have become much more difficult to deal with in a different context than it used to be the case before. Today, if we talk about cyber, we end up talking inevitably about internet governance as well. We end up talking about data protection and privacy, and vice versa. You can mention a number of fora where this happens. It's not always a welcome development, because people who used to belong to these different communities had different skills and expertise and different backgrounds. And at the moment, it seems that everything is in the same pot, which is also reflected in the international discussions on the future of internet governance. However, I would say a positive effect is that, and that was mentioned before, is that now internet governance has gone mainstream, if I may say so. So it is at the center of public opinion. It's not just limited to a group of experts, and it is it has become prominent for societies in general in a way which is completely unprecedented. So in this context, the Commission really welcomed both the announcement that was detailed by Fiona earlier of the US government about the globalization. They talk about privatization. We like to talk about globalization. Notice the little nuance of IANA functions and of ICANN, and also the results of Net Mundial. On the globalization, as we say, I would like to stress that we have been calling for this since the 1990s. So it's always been a European Commission position to say we need to have more open, inclusive and globalized ICANN. We need to have a globalized management of IANA functions. Many of you will have seen the communication that the Commission issued in February this year, where we were exactly advocating this kind of developments. And I have to say, I mean, immediately after the communication, we engaged in a very intensive discussion with the US government here in Washington, but also elsewhere in trying to see how open they would be to go in that direction. So when the announcement came out, it was for us definitely a very good sign, a sign in the good direction. And on Net Mundial as well, I would like to say a positive word, because I think, as Raquel mentioned, I mean, the mere fact that Net Mundial was able to come up with a document is a huge success. I remember discussions here before the event, really skeptical, saying 2-day conference, there's nothing you can do, it will be, you know, a flop, there won't be any agreement. So as such, the fact that the multi-stakeholder, also untranslatable in Italian, by the way, community could come up with a document is a positive sign. I used to say that Net Mundial was an iconic moment. That's how I used to define it, because beyond the results, in what it represents, that matters, and that gives a new flavor to this whole debate. And more specifically, in the final statement, we are pleased to see that there's progress, some progress made on some of the issues that we have flagged in the communications. So we do have some more concrete timelines now about the classical, if you want, internet governance teams, IGF, concrete proposals for improvement we should be discussed and possibly implemented by the end of 2015, the timeline for the transition of IANA, the statement that ICANN should serve the public interest and have clearly implementable and verifiable accountability. All these issues are very positive in terms of providing a frame, a further frame for developments. But also on the substance, I would like to recall that some of the themes or new issues that we had flagged in our communication are now reflected in the statement. For instance, the need to develop principles for transparency, accountability, and inclusiveness, both as they apply to internet governance organizations and stakeholders. They call for a better interaction between the technical community and the policymakers in general, which is a very important point in light of the first considerations that I have made, and also the intention of explore jurisdictional issues beyond the conference, just to mention a few. A final word I would say about scenarios. A bit of this doomsday discussions, remind me, if you want, of the discussions we had a couple of years ago about the euro. You will remember many think tanks and prominent thinkers as well in Washington saying a couple of years ago that the crisis of the euros would have led to the inevitable, dismantling of the European Union, kind of a domino effect. And the argument we used was like, well, the European Union is more resilient than you think. It's, it may appear fragile, but we're still there. We went through many crises. And 2 years after, you can see that it is still, for some countries, a value to fight for and to look at. So translating this, it's a comparison, of course, to the internet scenarios. I think it's a bit the same thing. Let's not focus, I would like to echo a bit what Christopher said, let's not focus on the worst case scenarios. Let's think that this community and this multi-stakeholder model has somehow managed to go forward, to protect the internet, to be an actor for values, fundamental freedoms, for all the good things that the internet has brought to us, and that in the end the internet community has more resilience, I would like to say, than we all sometimes may think. And I will stop it there then for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Derrick?
Thank you. I like that resilience. We have more resilience, and we should use that. I'm delighted to be here. I want to thank Susan Aronson and GW and ISOC-DC for not only inviting me, but for organizing this conference so soon on the heels of Net Mundial. Many of us just returned. Some of us are unpacking our bags. And so to have planned this so far in advance and really thought through wanting and needing to do this, I want to give them applause. I am the executive director of the Institute on Disability and Public Policy, and also something called the Collaboration Laboratory, or COTELCO. And I've been writing about what we now call internet governance for many years, since the mid-90s. And one of the key areas that I've focused on is the use of information technology for participation and engagement in these kinds of global governance activities. And I've also focused on human capacity development at a distance. And this is clearly one of the areas that needs to happen in a multi-stakeholder environment, is capacity development to be able to understand the technical complexities of these debates, so that more voices, not just the voices, Chris, that are just finding out that they have a stake, but if they walk into a meeting like this or in ICANN or AGF, thinking that they have a stake in the discussions, they're going to quickly get overwhelmed unless they are built up to be able to engage in those processes. And so that's kind of the way that I've been focusing on this for many years, and it shapes my perspectives tremendously. I was also honored to serve on the high-level multi-stakeholder committee, one of many committees created by Net Mondial, with David Johnson, also representing academia, and Jeanette Hoffman from Germany. We were the three academics on the HLMC. As an academic, I just want to say that we have unique pressures. You know, this is the last week of classes, and I have a mountain of papers to grade and code to grade. So I'm sorry if I'm a little disorganized this morning. I also want to give thanks to Brazil. As our colleagues have said, the Brazilian government, led by President Rousseff, called for Net Mondial. And it was, in some ways, courageous, but it was a very strategic decision by Brazil to organize this meeting. And in addition to the Brazilian government, all of the organizers with CGI, BR, and the OneNet community, in many ways, I argue that this was a model for a multi-stakeholder process. And I particularly like the way that the conference was organized in what I would call a fourfold multi-stakeholder process. And I even heard you, Raquel, talk about that in this, what I'm going to refer to as this fourfold model relative to the threefold model. And so we had governments, private sector, civil society, and then the technical and academic community. And I think that that's an important distinction. I think that those communities have different objectives, they have different resources, they have different organizational structures, they have different mechanisms for participating and preparing for these types of meetings. And I think it's important to think about that fourfold model. And again, this complex structure that Net Mondial created allowed for a very interesting, for those of you who were there or who were watching it on remote, a very interesting dynamic. One of the dynamics, I was just kind of chuckling to myself as I saw the questions start to emerge here with the lines and so forth. Well, in Sao Paulo, some of you may remember that there were 4 lines. And there was a line for governments, a line for private sector, a line for civil society, and then a line for technical and academic communities. And they got equal amounts of time. And so no voice was privileged over the other, including the remote participation voices. So when we went through they went through the lineup of people that were lined up to speak, they went 2 times to the remote participants, both for text-based comments, for remote hubs that may have had bandwidth limitations, and then also for video participation. So in many ways, I look at Net Mondial as a model for remote participation, and it's something that I will come back to several times. But that process of stakeholders being relatively equal in their participation, at least in the public fora and in the committees and so forth, was phenomenal. In addition to the comment part of it, you had the drafting committees. And again, Raquel, I've been trying to catch up with all of the criticism and so forth. But for those of you who've been involved in these processes for many years, you'll know that in many cases for international summits and so forth, the drafting process takes place somewhere else, in private, in secret, with a small committee. Here, it was public. I mean, it was, some people called it semi-public because the room was smaller, but it was a public process. People were watching the drafting negotiations take place. People were tweeting about what was happening in the drafting, which must have made some people very uncomfortable, but it was a very transparent and open process. So the statement that came out of that is certainly non-binding, but it is different. And it's different than the WSIS process. So WSIS was the World Summit on the Information Society, was transformative in itself, but it had limited multi-stakeholder participation. I heard some people referring to it as multilateralism, which is sort of, yes, but civil society and the private sector could speak for 5 minutes at the beginning of discussions of a section of text, as opposed to having equal opportunities to speak to a text. So this was a transformative conference from this multi-stakeholder process. It also highlights, and I heard somebody, I think it might have been Courtney, talk about the differential resources for multi-stakeholder participation. And this is just an objective critique of the process, and it's something that I've talked about for many years. Governments have the entire international diplomatic infrastructure to organize their participation. The private sector has very clear, organized institutions like the International Chamber of Commerce. They've created bases. It's very clear the organizational structures for organizing private sector engagement in a process like this. Civil society, on the other hand, is very heterogeneous in its policy perspectives, very limited in its organizational structures. So the organizational structures that were created for civil society's participation in WSIS have all but dissipated. And now we have an extremely lightweight civil society organization that's trying to organize civil society participation in a very complicated process. And I'm not sure it worked very well for civil society in this particular instance. And then for academia, we also have the Global Internet Governance Academic Network, which has become the leading network of scholars studying internet governance, is also a relatively lightweight structure. And so I think we need to think about what are the structures that enable this multi-stakeholder process to take place. So some people have referred to, and I think Milton wrote a very interesting blog post a couple of days ago on the what he called the post-WSIS environment. And I think part of what he was getting at was this was such a step forward in a number of ways in how we refer to civil society and how we refer to multi-stakeholderism, that it's post-WSIS. But I sort of would like to contradict Milton just a little bit. Is he still over there in the corner? Because this conference was so different. It was essentially a one-off conference. There are some calls for some kind of follow-up, but it's essentially a one-off conference, and the standing of the multi-stakeholder statement is quite different than the standing of a WSIS document, outcome document. So I think we have to be very clear about that. I also wanted to make two other quick comments. One of the questions that Susan posed was about how did governments play together and play together with civil society and work with each other. I think there were some very interesting dynamics that were perhaps not expected. One might have expected the BRICS countries to sort of band together and have kind of a coordinated engagement in the conference, and that didn't really happen. Brazil had a lot on the line to ensure that this was a successful conference. Russia, India basically distanced themselves from the outcome. China was in some ways silent, or as I think Milton and others have been talking about, sort of readjusting to this multi-stakeholder environment. So quite a different process. And lastly, I just want to say a little bit about where we go from here and what are the next steps. So one of the key things is what happens with IGF. And so many people are saying that this multi-stakeholder statement coming out of Net Mundial should now go and influence the debates and the discussions at many of these other fora, ICANN, IGF, the WSIS plus 10 discussions, and so forth. Well, my understanding is right now in Geneva, the Working Group on Enhanced Cooperation for IGF is basically denouncing the statement and saying, that's not our starting point, for discussions on enhanced cooperation. Another issue to think about in terms of IGF, which is the natural home, as Raquel said, for following up with some of these discussions. Ambassador Karklins, who's now been appointed as the chair of the MAG, made a very, very interesting statement at the high-level committee meeting, where he said, be careful what you ask for, basically. He said, look at the dynamic that occurred here at Net Mundial around the dynamics of negotiating a statement. People have criticized IGF because IGF doesn't have a negotiated statement at the end. I've argued that that is in some ways valuable because you're not in the contested terrain of trying to argue for your position to see if your language gets into the final statement or not. And so he said, think about how adding these kinds of negotiated statements in IGF would change the dynamic of IGF. And I would just leave us with thinking about what are the next steps and how do these how does this progress that comes out of what I would call a monumental conference in Sao Paulo, how does this transfer to the next steps that we're planning to take in all of our organizations?
Thank you. Becky.
So I feel like I'm going to bring this down from the sublime here. The topic of this discussion was future scenarios for IANA transitions, and every single person here, probably with the exception of Chris, has spoken about internet governance. I would like to start by saying the IANA functions are not, the ICANN is not internet governance. The IANA functions do not constitute internet governance. And if we keep conflating these things, this process will fail. I didn't feel like I was going to start out saying that when I came here, but there is no monolithic internet governance body. ICANN has a very limited function, and what we're talking about is the transitioning the certain performed by ICANN and IANA and supervised by the U.S. government, and we're talking about transitioning that sort of backstop supervision. That backstop supervision is not, as the USG would like you to believe, just a clerical function. The fact that you have a big hammer and you don't have to use it doesn't mean you don't have a hammer. And although Milton did point out one exception in terms of XXX, the USG has been a pretty benign supervisor here, and we should all recognize that. But we're talking about transitioning responsibility for making sure that that these functions and this limited set of functions are properly coordinated in a multi-stakeholder model. So I know that internet governance has gone mainstream, and there's like this huge temptation to talk about Snowden and all that, but this is not about surveillance by the U.S. government or any other government for that matter. This is about transition of a certain set of functions, and I really think it is critical for us to keep that in mind. But now let's talk about sort of, if you break up internet governance into a whole bunch of different little functions. I've taught a class at GW Law School on e-commerce for now 11 years. And when I started the class 11 years ago, I had students read three things for the first day. The first one is John Perry Barlow's Declaration of Independence, in which basically he posits there is no law but our law. And by our law, he means the law of individual communities in cyberspace. And to governments, he says, don't ask us where our badges are because, as Mel Brooks paraphrased the Treasurer of the Sierra Madre, we don't need no stinking badges. That was the John Perry Barlow view of the world. And I actually saw him deliver that speech, which was really quite incredible. On the other side of the spectrum is Jack Goldsmith, who basically says there is no law but sovereign law and then public and private international law. And you all should get yourselves together and realize this is not really anything special or new. We just need to use the tools we have and apply them in the world. And then, although I never thought this was the middle position, I have to say, the David Johnson, my colleague and mentor, David Post piece on law in cyberspace said essentially, well, you know, really there should be some law in cyberspace. And every year at the beginning of the semester, I think about changing the first class reading assignment. And every year I find myself handing out the same reading assignment because, you know, if you take internet governance or the law in cyberspace and you lay it out along those spectrums, you gotta deal with those pieces of the world. So, you know, Jack Goldsmith is a really smart guy, but he's not quite right. You can't simply rely on national sovereign law and international public and international private law to solve this problem. Sovereignty is a fact. You can't detract from that. You can't do anything about it. But what you need in a world where we are global is you need these kind of little bridging institutions that help you deal with sort of the mundane. So I said we're going from the sublime to the mundane, but that's really what it is like, what's the intersection? You know, you have all of this public international law and private international law, sovereign law, all of those things are going to stay there. But in the end, at this little juncture, we have to coordinate naming and addressing functions. And that's what we're talking about here. And ICANN has a little piece of internet governance, but it's a bridge. So when we talk about that bridge, so that was just context, really, but I think it's incredibly important context to talk about this. You know, we're talking about a little slice of internet governance, and we're talking about a bridge between worlds that, whether John Perry Barlow likes it or not, we can't change. So once you do that, and then you start talking about functional separation and structural separation, I come down to a fundamentally different ending spot, which is the problem that we have in this little tiny space is you still have to recreate the structures that we know about in governance as working. And those are separation of powers. Those are, you know, there's legislative branch and there's an executive branch and there's a judicial branch. Well, guess what? There's no judicial branch at ICANN. And if you think that ICANN should just operate on the sort of, you know, international law, private international law, public international law spectrum, what you get is no ability to correct course except at the most extraordinary and extreme edges of the world. So here's what I have to say about IANA transitions. It's not just about any kind of clerical function. The USG not only has provided this backstop, but it also has issued a request for comments on the IANA functions contract and determined, based on a multi-stakeholder input, what the service levels are for the IANA functions, all of those things. All of that stuff has to continue happening. And all of the people who are affected by those things have to have recourse. The U.S. government, by, you know, hanging the contract out there every 4 years, provided a kind of recourse for the community of direct consumers, registries, technical bodies, although it really in this case was registries, for those organizations. And so what we have to recreate is the accountability that's not there. And by the way, while we're doing it, it would be really good if we fixed ICANN accountability in general. So I NeuStar operates the .us top-level domain. I sit on the CCNSO Council. I come to this not only as a generic registry operator, but as a country code operator, and so my bottom line is you can't separate these functions and accountability. If we do, we'll fail. You can't confuse what's going on here with internet governance. If we do, we'll fail. We should pick up a little path. We should get it right. We should have a judiciary, an independent judiciary for ICANN, and make the creation and empower the creation of internet law, which would be ICANN law, so that David Johnson's vision of the world of this separate law can become a reality. And I think that's the only way it will.
Thank you very much, Becky. And with an eye towards the clock and remembering that we, this panel, are the only thing standing between the people in this room and their lunch, we're going to what I'm going to suggest is that let me first ask if any of the panelists have questions or comments for each other, and if not, we're going to go directly to questions from the floor and from that may have come in on the internet. So first, yes, go ahead.
Just
please,
one clarifying comment to Becky, if I could.
Please.
So Becky, when you say that the IANA functions are not internet governance, I think you said it fairly definitively like that. We know we're talking about an internet governance ecosystem, and in the IANA functions, I'm assuming you would say are part of the internet governance ecosystem.
They're a
exactly.
slice.
Right.
Okay, I was definitely being clear. They're a slice.
Yep.
But I just like the capital I, capital G.
Yes, please.
I was actually going to comment on the same point that you raised, actually, and instead of talking about slices, talking about layers, because I actually didn't scroll down far enough to get to some of my concluding remarks. But one of them was about the process going forward with IANA. One of the risks is the continued conflation of coordination of technical resources with the sort of the popularly considered internet governance content layer issues. And so again, this transition is happening at a time when more and more people are becoming aware, oh, it's a participative, open, oh, some of these technical things affect some of my content interests, and oh, maybe they should be lumped together or governed in the same way. But I fully agree with you, keeping a separation between infrastructure level, the logical level of the names and numbers, and then the content level where we at ICANN are continually saying, that's not our realm. Please, world, look for ways to address these contentious issues at that level so we can continue to do our very good work at the technical level is really one of the aims of, again, sort of the communication that we do and the engagement sphere. And I liked very much what you said, Becky, about sort of this juncture of bridging the sublime, and my very optimistic views that we can come up with new ways that are multi-stakeholder and making them implementable. I think if we were talking about coordination of the technical resources and other internet governance topics that were raised, for example, at Net Mondiale, there's a question now of whether the multi-stakeholder approach works for both of them. It has worked well for ICANN over the past 15 years. And so I think it's one of these things that developing that to a tool that really gets down to the finer points that you raised about getting the right mechanisms, from the sublime to mixed metaphors where the rubber meets the road, to use a very American one. But I think it's a very good point that you raised, and I hope it's one where ideas will be surfaced during the process of gathering input.
Go ahead, please.
Just to be brief, as I see there are questions lining up. One comment is building on Chris' last line. Definitely, there is no one size fits all. I think as CGI has almost 20 years of experience, ICANN 15 years of experience, and other multi-stakeholder approach that we can take into the table. So those are experiences, exercise that we can build on. And so let's remember that. And just on the comment that Derrick brought in and the clarification, thanks for that, because my point would be also to be referring to the Tunis agenda in the Article 34 regarding the internet governance definition that brings this large, I can read it, internet governance is the development and application by governments, the private sector, and civil society in their respective roles of shared principles, norms, rules, decision-making procedures, and programs that shape the evolution and use of the internet. So in this slides that IANA, ICANN takes place is what we used to call the internet governance ecosystem, right? So just my brief comment.
If I
Go
may
ahead, yes.
add in very quickly as well, I mean, yes, indeed, this maybe the title of this panel was more restrictive than what we actually discussed, and what I was asked to discuss. But I think you can't. Again, it's important to keep, and I take the big view, the diplomatic view, the more political view. It's important to keep context in mind. So when you say, Becky, and we have to do, and we have to make sure, and we, I think, you're referring to the multi-stakeholder community. So it makes sense in the whole process of transition to have a reflection about how this multi-stakeholder community will be shaped and will interact in the transition. And on this specific models, as you all know, the European Commission has not taken a position. So again, we leave it to the community to define. We don't have a prescriptive view. Something we had been in mind for a while was kind of a G20 in terms of loose model. But again, we don't have a very defined preemptive scenario in that respect.
Thank you. We have several people waiting for questions, and we probably have questions online, and we're running towards the end of our time. So what I'm going to ask is, for those of you who have questions, that's fabulous. Three requests I have. First, please clearly identify yourself. Secondly, please pose a question. We do not have time for explanations at this juncture, or we're not going to have lunch. And thirdly, whatever you have to say, please, it should be a question to which somebody or several people in the panel can respond. So with that in mind, I think you were the first one up. And you have to turn the microphone on when you.
Thank you.
Yes,
my name is Samar Chatterjee, SAFE Foundation. Based on whatever I've heard, and I've not been in Net Mundial, so I don't know what the final thinking was, but it looks like there has been a process of asking for getting United States government off this. And so I think it does, I hope most of you agree that it presents a new opportunity to have a multi-stakeholder system that has to be, and we don't need to be afraid of it, because a lot of people thought that the US government was the Goliath, and hopefully the David is going to come.
Thank you. I think what we're going to do is take two questions at a time. That way the panelists can respond to both of them. So please note the questions. And yes, ma'am, please introduce yourself.
Gary Devra, Center for Corporate Integrity. I'm of the opinion, by the way, that there's too many scholars in your organization, not enough everyday people. The non-compensationary security and copyrights. Ms. Burr clarified to me Postal's role, and that he worked as a government contractor to point root servers and directions in sync. We have Snowden, Manning, Assange, Madoff. We have spam and hacking. What guarantee do you have that a bad actor won't step into this? Also, forced arbitration is unconstitutional. No legal forum has been defined. How and when are you going to adjudicate the over 2.8 billion in growing community you referred to? And I'll ask you the same question I asked the lawyer who helped craft the unitary patent law in Europe. What currency are you going to use? Bitcoins? So the conversation is mostly about human rights. I want to hear a conversation, please, about copyrights, identity theft that goes on the second someone hits a page on the internet, they're being auctioned and bundled off. So talk more about the precautions you're putting in place, please.
Thank you. Those were a bunch of questions. So let me ask if who on the panel would like to comment on that. Yes, go ahead, Derrick.
I'll take a crack at the first one. I'll take a crack at the first question. So the idea of the new opportunity for developing some new system for internet governance, I think, is exactly some of the thinking behind the Net Mundial conference. Was that this was an opportunity to step outside of the existing organizations that are in place, all of them that we know about, the I organizations and such, and to sort of step outside that and think about new opportunities. And there's sort of a series of events that gave additional energy to Net Mundial. The Snowden revelations was one. President Rousseff's response to them was another, and her very strong, outraged UNGA speech. And then I think the European Union a document or a report that said basically the U.S. had lost the global trust and needed to do something to regain that trust. Was I think a major contributor to this movement. And then NTIA's decision to actually do it, that I think some people didn't think was necessarily going to happen.
Yeah.
So I think that gave additional energy to Net Mundial to step outside of the day-to-day internet governance ecosystem and try to offer some new ideas. And so again, the process of collecting from the world and the number of comments that came in from around the world were tremendous on both the principles and the roadmap. And so I think it's a good model to follow. Two small pieces of criticism, however. One is that time is always an issue. And so Net Mundial was very short in time. It was very different from most of these other international conferences. So even though WISIS, for example, these kinds of conferences might be 2 days, you usually have weeks and weeks and months of preparation before that. With preparatory conferences and so forth in negotiating the statements. And we didn't do that. We were actually negotiating the statement at the meeting, which rarely happens. And then also, I'm just thinking about Chris, for the deadline next week is fantastic that you're offering, the input and so forth, but for people to turn around and be able to make meaningful contribution from around the world in a short period of time, it's always difficult. So yes, I think it offers an opportunity, but I think there are a number of things that have to be put into place to let us capitalize on this opportunity.
I think the other questions are also on which currency would be used and intellectual property. Did anyone want to comment on those? Go ahead, Becky. Yes.
I just want to say spam and identity theft and hacking and those things and content control are not within the slice of authority for ICANN. And so we need to be careful to understand that this is a piece of the ecosystem and there are other places to deal with some of those other things.
Chris, did you have a comment?
So, well, first to thank Becky. Thanks for mentioning that. In terms of the bad actors that are out there, they've existed always. So whenever there's been a new innovation of any kind, whether it's a credit cards or telephones, or there's always somebody out there that's seeking to seek their personal advantage from it. What I find interesting is when, and it's an issue that's come up when talking about some of these stress tests and worst case scenarios, is that if you actually spend time at ICANN meetings, or they're a lot more chaotic actually than the Net Mundial was. There are many, many more sessions. There are many more contentious committees going on, and there's much more. It's this issue that's come up of control. So whether it's control of the governance mechanisms, it's like control of the internet. The really concept of control doesn't exist because it's more of an open source or bottom up construct. So the hope is that this multi-stakeholder balance that we have will continue to grow and continue to assure that there isn't really capture, and that the bad actors can be sort of mitigated from their attempts to sort of rig the system. The last there are some innovations too. So to the extent that technical developments in the names or the numbers actually do affect things like trademarks and intellectual property, the community of ICANN gets together and discusses ways to mitigate that and address that. And there are actually some very innovative processes for addressing disputes. There's a very interesting attempt to create a database of all of the world's trademarks and all of the languages and all of the alphabets that exist as a tool that can be used. And these are ideas and constructs that came out of the policy development process. So again, there are attempts to address some of these issues, even though, as Becky said, and as I said, they're at a layer above the unique identifiers and the technical resources. And I agree that the big challenge now in gathering inputs for all of this is the capacity building that Derrick mentioned. Finding a way to translate what, everybody comes to the table with what's important to them. And so they will zero in on that part of the picture. And everybody comes to the table with a different set of expertise and experience. And again, finding a way for them to fit in a way that they're informed, that they're open to listening to the other agendas from the other stakeholders that are there, is very much a learning process. And it's hard to do with speeches, it's hard to do with infographics, it's hard to do with academic treatise. It's better to try it. So I would invite you to come or follow on an ICANN meeting. They're all openly available.
Yeah. By the way, let me apologize to everyone. We are running so far over that what I'm going to ask is that the 4 people who have been waiting in line to ask their questions all ask their questions. Those of us on the panel all have pencils and paper, and we can jot the questions down. But in order to get all of the questions in and permit people, and then I'm also going to ask the panelists to please keep your responses brief so that we don't miss our lunch because we kept on talking. So why don't you please start? And
Steve Del Bianco with Net Choice. Quick questions for Becky and Beatrice. I almost always agree with everything Becky says, but I worry that ICANN long ago crossed the line into capital IG internet governance. Protection of trademarks and intellectual property has been part of the domain name system function for years. And in the new round of GTLDs, we are using new GTLD contracts to control bad behavior in regulated industries and sensitive sectors. We're already crossed that line. And that's to stop bad behavior. Beatrice and Derrick have talked about good things like capacity building or public interest taxing authority to add more and more new fees on every domain registrant to fund these good things in the public interest and capacity building.
Thank you.
David Johnson, closely related and riffing off the levels analysis of Chris. I realize you don't want to steer the process, but my question is, some of the fear here comes from the concern that the domain name system in particular can be used by withholding domain names to police content and behavior. I wonder whether ICANN might make a contribution at the appropriate time by figuring out how to commit itself in a binding way, not to do that, so that at least that part of the discussion could relax.
Thank you.
Joni Brennan, Kantara Initiative. My question is around DNS and its ability as part of a trust layer for identity management, and data exchange. That's where DNS kind of starts to get tied in with privacy and user based touching issues. But given that NetMundial was both a big success in terms of the kind of new multi-stakeholder approach attempt, but also perhaps partly a failure in terms of the space around compromise and the weakening of the necessary and proportionate principles. So my question is, what's the vision for the successful balance scenario of priorities from governments who may have a need to surveil and provide security versus industry who need trust and need to have exchange across borders versus the end users who need their privacy protected as citizens of the internet?
Thank you.
And excuse me, Philip Corwin, Virtual Law. The ICANN CEO had told the community that he felt he had converted President Rustoff to the multi-stakeholder approach when he met with her. In actuality, at NetMundial, she went halfway there. She said there was no opposition between multilateral and multi-stakeholder. It didn't bring along the other BRIC nations. Russia, India, China, and many other nations in attendance reiterated their support for ultimately multilateral control of Internet governance. Given the likelihood of more government involvement in Internet governance, particularly the IGF becomes more decisional, is this worrisome given the continued commitment to multilateral approaches by governments representing at least half the world's population?
Thank you. Quickly, I'll just, the first question had to do with limits on ICANN, and are there ways that the potential for abuse could be limited? The second question was similar, also had to do with limits on content that could be. The third question had to do with a balance between the rights of individuals, the interest of governments, the interest of business. And the last question had to do with the relationship between multi-stakeholder and multinational governance. So why don't we just begin at this end and work? Actually, why don't we start the other way? Start with Becky and then work our way down and ask each one on any of those four that they're comfortable with.
Okay, Steve, the IP and copyright issue, like all things in ICANN, is all my fault. We crossed that bridge and we confused. I think we brought disputes about trademarks into the original ICANN bucket, and that it was an awkward fit. I have always thought that ICANN would be better focusing on best practices in those areas as opposed to the mandated areas. We tried to cabinet with disputes about registration only as opposed to disputes about the use. And I think what happened in the last round is we got all over that. And I think there's going to be a lot of unhappiness about the provisions in the registry agreements that hold out the promise to people that there's real, that there are real teeth there. But I totally agree with you. And if we had a constitution that said that is essentially ICANN's mission and core values statement, using its taxing authority for all kinds of other things would be something we could resist. David, same thing with policing content. We need a constitution that prohibits that. To the identity and authentication, I really, really, really hope ICANN just stays away from that as far as possible. The best answer for balancing consumer interest, civil liberties, and all of those other things is to have a bunch of competing systems out there for authentication, and it shouldn't be a government job, and it shouldn't be an ICANN job. I'm all for multi-stakeholder, not multilateral.
Thank you, Derrick.
Thank you. So a couple of responses. So I'll take a slightly different tack on Steve's comment. So if some of us are arguing that there should be good things, capacity building and such, there then is a question of how do we pay for them? Absolutely. So there are a number of interesting examples of where there are self-funding mechanisms where people are applying to things like at the Diplo Foundation and they're learning internet governance. But I think that to help facilitate the sense of ownership of this process, we have to find a way to build capacity for people to engage and understand in these issues. And so where it comes from, that's a different story. But I think we have to I think it benefits everybody to try and address that issue. Two other questions I wanted to address. One, the possibility that parts of Net Mundial were a failure because of the dropping out of some issues that were important to some participants, particularly some of civil society, and not highlighting and surfacing some of the issues like a stronger statement on surveillance and so forth. I wouldn't call that a failure necessarily. I think what you would call a failure is what almost happened. For those of you who were in the room at the end, there were several parties who almost walked out. And if certain things were left in, they would have walked out, and it would have been it certainly would have been disastrous from the Brazilian perspective, but I think many of us would have been unhappy with that as an outcome. And that was close to happening. And so I think it's important to recognize that in these kinds of international negotiations, it's in fact a negotiation, and everybody's not going to get everything that they want. All stakeholders are not going to get all that they want. And I think that there could have been far more strategic approaches to try to include some of those issues with a different approach rather than the way it happened. And then lastly, about the multilateral versus multi-stakeholder. So when I heard people start talking about it in that way, I was a little bit concerned. Well, the point is, there definitely are clearly countries who prefer a multilateral approach. And so, we mentioned India, we mentioned Russia, there are others who would prefer that. But there are a lot of developing countries who do see that environment as more conducive to their interests. They see one country, one vote. They see their ability to influence that process a little bit more. And so they keep arguing for going in that direction. So going back to what I was saying earlier, is we've got to find ways to have more ownership in this multi-stakeholder model and being able to participate and get out of it what you want to see out of it. So otherwise, there's going to be this continued pressure back to that space.
Beatrice.
Well, one point on the ICANN related questions, that we have been traditionally stressing for years in this debate has been the role of the GAC Secretariat, of the GAC and the GRAC Secretariat in particular. So we have always advocated for having a full independent and effective and reinforcing, this kind of check and balance function versus temptation of having complete private interest-led developments. So I would like to stress it once more. On EID, very quickly, I would say, have a look. The Commission the European Parliament has just voted a regulation actually on trusted identities and EID. Thinking also about cybersecurity, it's a very difficult balancing act. All governments are struggling with privacy, versus security, trust, and allowing for other functions to take place. But I think in both cases, and without entering into detail, both in the cyber domain and now in the EID domain, we are looking at formulas where we have flexible implementation, where we have a lot of different models to apply, so a plurality, as Becky said, of different models, and then we try to build the parameters for trust. That's what we're trying to do at the moment. So it's not the single one size fits all, but it's what are the parameters for trust. And finally, on the governmental aspects, I stress once more that we are not in favor for intergovernmental solutions at all. However, think that governments have stakes now. What strikes in the internet, 10 years ago we didn't. Because 10 years ago the internet was not as relevant for societies as it is now. So there are some legitimate stakes if in the multi-stakeholder model, if I can translate, which reflect genuine concerns of public policy, and we cannot take them away from the debate.
Raquel.
So I was told I have 1 minute, or the camera will pick my hand, so let me be very quick. First of all, with the wording of bad guys, I'm not sure if you are tackling the criminal behavior, then you have a mechanism put in place. You should be law, whether online, offline, to take that one. But if you are taking bad guys as someone with other thinking, whether the industry is looking for some models to take profit, or governments are looking for, not being so comfortable in this environment of multi-stakeholderism or equal footing, in fact. So you do need, this is a stake from the multi-stakeholder model, that you need to work through these differences and find the common ground to go forward, right? And how you trust, or how you ensure that you are not driving into the wrong direction, is the community balance is the richness of this model, right? I hope I'm being clear that we can take offline later. On the privacy issue and how, if I took that right, governments would be forwarding that. I can say for Brazil that Marco Civil brought some of the basic grounds for a kind of data protection, but the implementation piece that I was mentioning is that it will be very important. Will, among other things, bring probably a new law on data protection, or the law. Brazil doesn't have one right now. After this being taken as over-regulating, I just need to mention that you need to take that some countries like Brazil and most of Europe does adopt the civil law instead of the common law. So it is important to have this piece of regulation in place to make sure it's enforced. And on the last one, on the capacity building and engagement piece, besides the DPRO Foundation, ISOC has the Next Generation Leaders capacity building, some e-learning process in place. We also have a successful program bringing government people to the IETF to understand that it's not a black box, that how it works, the 101 on the technical piece. I had the opportunity to be there and to understand this process and to see lively how it changes government perspective on this technical experience. So that's it.
Thank you.
The hammer is kicking.
Chris, I'm sorry you're going to get a quick wrap up here.
Okay, I'll try to do it in 4 sentences. Agree that there is a distinction between the content layer, the trademark, the privacy, the spam, the child protection, all of that, and the technical functions, and we would be delighted that there'd be more awareness there. So echoing what Becky and others have said. David, with regard to your scenario, I think that's one of the stress tests and one of the things that should be raised, and please, submit those concerns and that desire in the public comment processes.
Chris, we're going to have to end. So
last sentence, there's an article in the People's Daily of China, came out yesterday. It says, summarize, and again, I don't speak Chinese, so I need people to help me with this. It says positive things about multi-stakeholderism and Net Mondial, as long as national sovereignty can be respected.
Really?
So
please join me in thanking the panel members. And